So the subject for today is called the whip of God. God has always used different nations, different groups of people to teach his children. At that time, they were the descendants of Abraham, and then later on, they were called Jews, to teach them lessons why they should not rebel and disobey and so on. So the whip of God for a long, long time has been mostly, almost always, the kings of the north of Jerusalem. And today we're going to see not just how God has used them, but why God used them and who are these kings of the north. And eventually we'll come to what I had been telling you for the last two sessions, and we'll find the truth in regard to those points. Today we'll see the annihilation of not one, but two races, complete annihilation of two races in this earth's history. If you recall, we read this last week from the Bible, Matthew 24:15. Maybe I'll have a word of prayer before we start reading God's word. You can join with me. Father in heaven, we thank you for this opportunity. We thank you for thy love and thy mercy and grace. And as we study thy word, we ask for light from heaven. We ask for understanding and presence of mind and a clear, open heart to appreciate and accept thy truth. And may that be warning bells for all of us of what is coming soon in this earth's history. So grant us understanding and thy blessing, and help me with the presentation so that everybody gets it clear and it's a blessing to all. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So Matthew 24:15 said, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. So if you recall, I said last time, Jesus himself, when he walked this earth, when he was teaching the people in Israel, in Jerusalem, he encouraged to read the book of Daniel because there are some very special truths revealed at that time in the book of Daniel, sorry. So what does it mean when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet? So abomination simply means something hateful, detestable. And mostly it's got to detesting idolatry, according to the Bible concordance. And desolation, we all know, something that desolates and destroys. So when you see that power, who has been an abomination of desolation for a long time, standing in the holy place, we read the verses after that last week, what we have to do: run from the cities and from your country homes to the mountains, and so on. So because he said, whoso readeth the book of Daniel, let him understand. So we are going to see some world history of real events which was prophesied more than 2,500 years ago, and they happen to be accurately true. And you can look it up for yourself in all the reliable sources of history. They were accurately fulfilled. So we'll begin from the book of Daniel, chapter 2. That's where the prophetic history of world events begins. It starts in Daniel chapter 2, that is repeated on Daniel chapter 7 in a different form, which I will show you. That is repeated a third time in Daniel chapter 11. So if God is repeating, he finds it fit or deems it fit and necessary to repeat something not once, not twice, but three times, it has to be of importance. And that is what we're going to quickly cover today. We cannot cover every detail, but I can help you with the resources that you might need if you need to see them, study them in broader detail for yourselves. So verse 1 in chapter 2 of Daniel says that King Nebuchadnezzar, his name was King Nebuchadnezzar, the Bible is very clear on that. History says that. And King Nebuchadnezzar was in a place called Babylon, which is the current day Iraq, a corner of Iraq closer to Turkey. That's where Babylon was. It's completely ruined and destroyed. But in fact, Saddam Hussein wanted to be the Nebuchadnezzar of today. He clearly mentioned that in his time. So King Nebuchadnezzar dreams a dream and his spirit was troubled. Spirit means his mind. So why was it troubled? We'll find that out. Verse 16, Daniel is summoned and he assures the king that he would show him the dream and the interpretation. So that tells us that the king had a dream in the night and he happened to forget the dream. So now he needed somebody to come and explain to him and help him find or inform him through their magical or powers or astrological powers that the wise men of his kingdom had, to tell him what the dream meant or what he dreamt first and then the meaning thereafter. So he tells the captain of the guards, Arioch, to go and bring all the wise men, and they all come and they tell him, how can we ever do this and so on? We cannot tell, only the gods can tell what you dreamt. If you tell us the dream, we will tell you the interpretation and so on. So he was very upset that nobody could tell him what he dreamt, which is common sense, no human being can anyway. So he sent a decree to kill all the wise men of Babylon. And this is around 605 BC. I'll show you that on the screen as well. Or 605, yeah. So Daniel, one of the captives of the Hebrew captives from Jerusalem, along with many others who were taken captives by King Nebuchadnezzar, was also in the kingdom of Babylon, and he with three other friends of his were from the good royal families of Jerusalem. So they were brought in for training. So they were training to be the wise men of Babylon. So then Daniel asked Arioch, the captain of the guards, why is this decree so rashly given? And Arioch said, nobody can tell the king his dream, leave alone the interpretation. So Daniel said, can you take me to the king, please? I'd like to have a word with him. So he is taken to King Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel said, no human being can do that. Only God of the heaven can reveal that. Can you give me a day? I will let you know, as verse 16 says, that I'll show you the dream and the interpretation. So King Nebuchadnezzar gives him a day, and then verse 17 to 18, we see that Daniel and his three friends pray that night, and in the night, God reveals the dream to Daniel in the night vision. And then verse 25 to 35, we see how Daniel meets the king and shows him what he had dreamt. And then verse 36 to 45, Daniel relays the interpretation of the dream. And this is the dream he had. We're going to run it very short. He saw a huge, massive image. It was an image which had the head of gold, the breast of silver, and the thighs of brass, and legs of iron, and the feet of iron and clay. So, cutting it short, head of gold, Daniel told him, represents you, king of Babylon. So Babylon reigned, and you can look this up in reliable history, 605 BC to 539. That was the reign of gold, Babylon. And then a little short in power and valor was Persia, which had the breast of silver, which reigned from 539 to 331 BC. Then we had thighs of brass, which represents Greece, 531 to 168 BC. Then we have legs of iron, which is Rome, 168 BC to 476 AD. And during this time of Rome, we had Caesars and so on, and Jesus had come at this time and walked this planet Earth. And the last one is the 10 toes and the feet, the iron and clay, divided Europe. And you know that clay and iron can never be mixed together. This is the image that Nebuchadnezzar had seen, and Daniel explained to him who these represent. And then we know from history the following years that they reigned on planet Earth. They were, for example, Babylon ruled the whole world, likewise Persia, likewise Greece and Rome. Then we had the divided Europe. So the 10 divided kingdoms considering the 10 toes of that image, the 10 divided kingdoms of Rome were this. They were the Huns, they were the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Franks, the Vandals, the Suevi, the Burgundians, the Heruli, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Lombards. In today's language, the Huns are the Germans, Ostrogoths, the empire of the north of the Black Sea, which was part of the Russian peninsula, and this particular one was pulled out by the roots. Then we have the Visigoths, they're the Spain of today. Then the Franks, which is France. Then the Vandals, which also were pulled out by the roots, ruled Africa from Carthage. They don't exist anymore. And next week we'll cover them in more detail. Then the Suevi in Portugal, then the Burgundians, which is Switzerland, then the Heruli, which was the East Germanic people originally from Scandinavia. They too were pulled out by the roots. And number 9, Anglo-Saxons, which is England and Scotland, and Lombards, Italy. So these are the modern names of those places. Now, 3 kingdoms were pulled out by the roots. We saw that. Heruli, Ostrogoths, and Vandals. They don't exist. They were completely eliminated. And next week I'm going to cover how and why and who did that. Then in chapter 7, this time Daniel himself is shown a vision. And he sees Babylon as a lion with wings of an eagle. Then he sees Medo-Persia where this bear is raised on one side because Persia became the most powerful. Then we have 3 ribs on his mouth. Then we have Greece, which has 4 heads. And then we have Rome, the deadly dragon-like animal. Now, if you put this side by side, so Babylon was from that period 605 to 539 BC, and so on and so forth. The same meaning, Daniel this time is shown a vision of these 3 animals with more information about these kingdoms and what they will be doing and how they will be doing. So these are the 4 beasts of Daniel 7 and Daniel 2 on the right-hand side. So God deemed it fit for these people, for his people, and for the world even today to know and to see why he gave a repetition of the same truths in different forms. It's about world history and world kingdoms. Then he repeats it the 3rd time in the 11th chapter of the book of Daniel. And the 11th chapter starts with the 3 kings of the Medes and the Persians. Then we come down a couple of verses later, Greece and Alexander the Great. And the latter part of Greece, we hear something or we see something and read that is called King of the South, which is the Egyptian head of divided Greece. Because if you remember, Greece in the image that Daniel saw in in the 7th chapter, he has 4 heads. After Alexander died, his kingdom was divided into 4 parts. Cassandra, Lycamus, and Ptolemy and Seleucus. So the Egyptian head of that divided Greece of Egypt was called Ptolemy. He was reigning the Egyptian area of the kingdom of Greece. And then we have Seleucus, who was heading the Syria-Turkey part of Greece kingdom at that time. So that was a little mention there of the story, but it was the same kingdom, Greece. Then the 3rd kingdom was pagan Rome, which means the heathen Rome. And then we have the papal Rome, where you have the papal hierarchy ruling for a certain period of time. Then we have France from verses 36 to 39 of Daniel 11. Then we have King of the North, which is Turkey, very precisely Turkey, in chapter 40 of Daniel 11. So in chapter 11, God doesn't show Daniel the vision and rather doesn't include Babylon, but starts straight from Medo-Persia, because he is showing him more information and more details of the latter end of world's history. So there are 7 kings and 7 kingdoms. rather 7 kingdoms to be more precise: Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, the Greece, pagan Rome, papal Rome, France, and king of the north. But what is important to see in chapter 11, I'm not going in details because my main goal is to show you something more important at this juncture in time of our presentations. As I said, I can send you the um, information book or video if you like to get more detail on this subject. So Daniel 11 mostly speaks about kings, not so much about kingdoms. So the king of Babylon, the king of Medes and the Persians, the king of Greece, the king of pagan Rome, the king of papal Rome, king of France, king of the north, which is Turkey. Now, I said about north and south. So if you look in the map, you can see where Israel is and where Jerusalem is. So on the top, where river Euphrates flows, it starts from Turkey via Syria all the way to Iraq, and then goes a little bit towards the beginning of Iran, which is west of the northern belt of Jerusalem. So whenever God says north, it means Syria, Turkey, Iraq, they were all northern kingdoms of Israel. And south always has been used in Bible history and interpretation as Egypt. So the background: before Islam, the Middle East was characterized by a diverse religious landscape of polytheism, Judaism, and Christianity, alongside Zoroastrianism, because Islam did not exist at this time in history. So, what is Zoroastrianism? That was around mid 600 BC, in the time of the Persians who ruled the world, which today is called Iran. So that is still there to some extent even till today. So we had Zoroastrianism at that time, that is before Islam came into existence. Then we have Arab polytheism, which was the indigenous religion of pre-Islamic Arabia, centered on the worship of numerous gods and spirits with prominent deities including Hubal, Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. Worship involved local shrines and temples, with the Kaaba in Mecca famously containing around 360 idols. And that's why when Muhammad came into the scene, he went and destroyed all the idols in Mecca and around that place. Now, what I want you to know, which is more important today, is before 8600, Islam did not exist. So, who were living in all the so called Middle East at that time? We just saw there they were characterized by whom? And there are one or two that I know of in the late 80s, mid to late 80s. They had traveled all around Middle East to do some research and survey. They were historians and archaeologists, and they saw with evidence that all the countries of the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and rest of them around it, east, west, north, south, they were mostly filled by Sabbath keeping Christians. And at that time, between 200 to 600 AD, some of the best builders in the world, construction builders, were the builders from Syria. And how did suddenly, little after 600 AD, Islam come into the picture? Now, I'm going to identify that for good reasons, because it's going to sink in with the topic next week. How Islam came in, and when did it happen, and who was behind it. And these are facts of history, which, if you dig deep, you can find it as well. Now, let's go down the history lane, starting from the 40th verse of Daniel 11. And I'm going to read it fast because there's lots to cover. These are the events of history that lead to us where we are today. And that's why I just wanted us to have a little bit of a background. So, verse 40 of Daniel 11, and at that time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots, and with horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over. So here's a recorded history from an historian. This application of the prophecy calls for a conflict to spring up between Egypt, France, and Turkey. And France in 1798, which year, as we have seen, marked the beginning of the time of the end. And if history testifies that such a triangular war did break out in that year. At this juncture, however, the situation of Napoleon began to grow precarious. The French fleet, which was his only channel of communication with France, was destroyed by the English under Nelson at Aboukir. And on September 2 of the same year, 1798, the Sultan of Turkey, under feelings of jealousy against France, artfully fostered by the English ambassador at Constantinople, and exasperated that Egypt, so long a semi-dependency of the Ottoman Empire, should be transformed into a French province. He declared war against France. Thus, the king of the north, which is Turkey, came against him, which is France, in the same year that the king of the south, Egypt, pushed at both at the time of the end, which is another conclusive proof that the year 1798 is the year which begins that period. And all of which is a demonstration that this application of the prophecy is correct. For so many events meeting so accurately, the specifications of the prophecy could not take place together and not constitute a fulfillment of the prophecy. So, time of the end basically began at 1798. And let me read this last part as well. On the 18th of March, the siege commenced. Napoleon was twice called away to save some French divisions from falling into the hands of the Mussulman hordes that filled the country. Twice also a breach was made in the wall of the city, but the assailants were met with such fury by the garrison that they were obliged, despite their best efforts, to give over the struggle. After continuance of 60 days, Napoleon raised the siege, sounded for the first time in his career the note of retreat, and on the 21st of May 1799 commenced to retrace his steps to Egypt. So before 680, Islam did not exist. But now we have gone about 1200 years further up, 1798. Then the next verse says in Daniel 11:41, he shall, that's the king of the north, shall enter into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. Who do these mean? Let's have a read of that quickly. Abandoning a campaign in which one-third of the army had fallen victims to war and the plague, the French retired from Saint Jean d'Acre and, after a fatiguing march of 26 days, re-entered Cairo in Egypt. They thus abandoned all the conquests they had made in Judea and the glorious land which is Palestine or Jerusalem, with all its provinces, here called countries, fell back again under the oppression rule of the Turk. Who was ruling in Turkey at this time? Islam, of course. Edom, Moab, and Ammon, lying outside the limits of Palestine, south and east of the Dead Sea and the Jordan, were out of the line of march of the Turks from Syria to Egypt, and so escaped the ravages of that campaign. On this passage, Adam Clarke has the following note. These and other Arabians, they, the Turks, have never been able to subdue. They still occupy the deserts and receive a yearly pension of 40,000 crowns of gold from the Ottoman emperors to permit the caravans with the pilgrims for Mecca to have a free passage. So these Edom, Moab, and Ammon have been in a payroll, if you like, from the Turks so that people can go travel during Mecca and have a free passage from those borders. Then Daniel 11:42, he shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. So on the retreat of the French to Egypt, a Turkish fleet landed, 18,000 men of Abu Khair. Napoleon immediately attacked the place, completely routing the Turks and re-establishing his authority in Egypt. So you can read this for yourself. You can pause the slide and see it for yourself, because if I do it today, it might take quite a bit of your time. But meanwhile, the English government, as an ally of the Turks, had resolved to wrest Egypt from the French. And this is what happens in March 13, 1800. And we'll go to the next page. What happened at Ramenei, a French corps of 4,000 men was defeated by 8,000 English and 6,000 Turks. So Egypt did not escape. Turks put Egypt under a pump at that time as well. 1911-43. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. What does that mean? History gives the following facts. When the French were driven out of Egypt and the Turks took possession, the Sultan permitted the Egyptians to reorganize their government as it was before French invasion. He asked of the Egyptians neither soldiers, guns, nor fortifications, but left them to manage their own affairs independently, with the important exception of putting the nation under tribute to himself. In the Articles of Agreement between the Sultan and the Pasha of Egypt, it was stipulated that the Egyptians should pay annually to the Turkish government a certain amount of gold and silver, and 600,000 measures of corn, and 400,000 of barley. The Libyans and the Ethiopians, the question says, Dr. Clark, the unconquered Arabs who have sought the friendship of the Turks, and many of whom are tributary to them at the present time. Then we have Daniel 11:44. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Who is this him? King of the north. Therefore he shall go forth with great fear to destroy and utterly to make away many. This is talking about the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856. And that time Turkey was called the sick man of the east, as you see in the paragraph below, whose treasuries were empty, whose rulers were vile and imbecile, and whose subjects were rebellious and threatening secession, rushed with such impetuosity into the conflict. The prophecy said that they should go forth with great fury, and when they thus went forth in the war aforesaid, they were described in the profane vernacular of an American writer as fighting like devils. England and France, it is true, soon came to the help of Turkey, but she went forth in the manner described, and as is reported, gained important victories before receiving the assistance of these powers. So these were from Russia and Persia, the Crimean War, who were trying to come and attack Turkey. But with the help of English and France, Turkey fought and put them down. That's what the verse is talking about in verse 44. That is all finished. Now, what remains now to fulfill is Daniel 11:45. And that event, for this event to be fulfilled, there are preparations behind the curtains, or underground, if you like, are already or have been happening for quite a few years. And this is what the verse says. And he shall plant. Now, he again is the king of the north. We saw from verse 40, 41, 42, 43, king of the north was always Islam. Because remember, I said Daniel 11 is talking about kings, not about kingdom. So at this point in time, we're talking about Daniel 11:45. Islam doesn't yet have a king. They call him the Caliph or Khalifa in the Urdu language or in Arabic language. It says, and he, the king of the north, shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, and yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. That means he will plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and in the glorious holy land, and yet he shall in the future, shall means future, right? Come to his end, and none shall help him. I'll briefly explain this from the history. Palestine, which contains the glorious holy mountain, the mountain on which Jerusalem stands between the seas, the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean, is a Turkish province. And if the Turks should be obliged to retire hastily from Europe, which is the geographical site of Turkey, he could easily go to any point within his own dominions to establish his temporary headquarters here, appropriately described as the tabernacles. So, which means in this verse, I told you a little bit week before last and last week, the king of the north will be established, will be elected. That means there will be Khalifa or a Caliph elected soon. And it's been on the process, and campaigning and counseling has been happening, especially since 2011, 2012 in the Islam arena worldwide. So once that Caliph is elected and accepted by all of Islam worldwide, they will march all the ones from the Arabian Gulf, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, all of them will march to Jerusalem to make it their official capital. That's what he's talking about. Making shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. The glorious holy mountain has always been Jerusalem and Bible prophecy. Now, this is what I want you to see now. See, here's some information. Turkish president calls on Muslims to invade Jerusalem. This was in May 19, 2015. Not from now. That's quite a while ago, 10 years ago. Then, the same year, on May 28, 2015, Turkish Prime Minister appealed to re-establish the Ottoman Empire because Turkey and that area, Syria, was once called the Byzantine Empire, then it was called the Constantinople in the time of Rome, and then later on the Ottoman Empire, and then, of course, with the sick man of the East in the Crimean War. So, what he is saying here is the Ottoman Empire should be re-established. He's making an appeal. This is the President Erdogan of Turkey, right? Then here's another one. Rebirth of the Caliphate, witnessing the reincarnation of the Ottoman Empire on the ashes of Islamic freedom from a match lit by the Muslim Brotherhood. Do you know that the throwing down of Prime Minister Mubarak in Egypt, I think was it 2012, if I'm not mistaken, it was the Muslim Brotherhood who threw down Mubarak from his throne. And Muslim Brotherhood is one of the oldest organizations of Islam. I think around the 1930s they were formed. And their main training ground, though it's originally from Egypt, but their main training center has been in Turkey for a long, long time. And they have many offshoots, the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas in Palestine is one of them. But they have their own system there now. And I don't want to take names, but there are many others who have come out of Muslim Brotherhood and they have formed various organizations in various names. Now, what is this gentleman saying here? He's one of the so-called spiritual leaders of Islam. Jerusalem will be the capital of the caliphate, Allah willing, he says. And then the Voice of America records here, Erdogan is the man who would be the caliph. So that has been happening for a long time. Now, will he be the actual man who will be the caliph? We don't know. Time will tell. But what I'm trying to share with you is this movement, this propaganda, this push has been happening for quite some time now. The title of our subject was The Whip of God, Kings of the North. Now, in earlier times in history, before Christ, I'm talking about 700 to 600 BC, around that time, God used the kingdoms of the north to go and discipline his people, the Jews, or the descendants of Abraham. Let's read this from Jeremiah 1:14 to 16. Then the Lord said unto me, out of the north an evil shall break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land. For lo, I will call all the families of the kingdoms of the north, said the Lord, and they shall come, and they shall set every one his throne at the entering of the gates of Jerusalem, and against all the walls thereof round about, and against all the cities of Judah. And I will utter my judgments against them, touching all their wickedness, who have forsaken me, and have burnt incense unto other gods, and worshipped the works of their own hands. So whenever his people have gone into idolatry, making idols and worshipping them like gods, that is what has angered him and made him sad. And then he has sent the kingdoms from the north to go and discipline them and teach them a lesson. Happened over and over again. And I want to tell you, and I'll show you in a little while, that it's going to happen very soon from now again. Jeremiah 6:22 to 24. Thus said the Lord, behold, a people cometh from the north country, which is Syria, Turkey, Iraq, that area. The olden times, in the book of Genesis and thereafter, not Genesis, but after that, they're known as the Assyrians. And then came Babylon. And then came Persia and so on. And a great nation shall be raised from the sides of the earth. They shall lay hand on bow and spear. They are cruel and have no mercy. Their voice roareth like the sea, and they ride upon horses, set in array as men for war against thee, O daughter of Zion. We have heard the fame thereof. Our hands wax feeble, Anguish had taken hold of us, and pain as a woman in travail. So those are the nations of the north: Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and even it was Iran at a certain stage. But it's mostly Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. They are the kings of the north. Going forward, see what it says in the book of Joel 1, 6, and 7. For a nation is come up upon my land, that means they have already come, strong and without number, whose teeth are like the teeth of a lion, and he had the cheek teeth of a great lion. He hath laid my vine waste, and barked my fig tree. He hath made it clean bare, and cast it away. The branches thereof are made white. Now here's the sad story, and it is truth, which is going to happen very soon. Behold, the eyes of the Lord God are upon the sinful kingdom, which is the kingdom of Judah or Israel, the Jews, the Israelites. He says, I will destroy it from off the face of the earth. Question: do the Jews still live today? Is the kingdom of Israel and Israelites still alive today? Of course they are. But what is God saying here in Amos 9:8? I will destroy it from off the face of the earth. That's God's statement. God never lies. His word is accurate and truth. Saving that I will not utterly destroy the house of Jacob, said the Lord. It means he'll keep a small people who have committed them through repentance completely to Christ and submitted to Christ and Christ likeness. So, at the fulfillment of the verse below, Israel is totally annihilated. When a caliph or khalifa is elected in Turkey or Syria, they will march together. The whole Islam from the east, I remember I told you last week, from Russia, from India, from all the countries, and the whole passage will be cleared because they are coming and going and taking control of Jerusalem. And it is evident when they do that, they have to destroy all Israel and all Jews except those who have given themselves to God, so God will save them. It's a very solemn thing. The Jews, unrepentant Jews, will be completely annihilated from planet Earth at this time. And that's what the verse we read in Amos said. And where are they coming from? From the north. God has again used providentially the same kingdoms of the north to come and annihilate the people who were called by his name for many, many years, many centuries. Now, this is where I want you to understand about the kingdoms of the past and the present, and we'll quickly try and finish this soon. Revelation 17, 7 to 11. And the angel said unto me, wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman. Woman is also a church in Bible prophecy, only in Bible prophecy, not otherwise. And of the beast that carrieth her, which had the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast that thou sawest was, and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, and go forth into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was, and is not, and yet is. And it's promised to you last week and the week before, we will see together who the beast is and how did he come about, and the rest of it as we have studied and what we'll see today as well. And here is a mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth, and there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. Remember these 4 creatures that Daniel saw in Daniel 7? These are the 4 kingdoms that Daniel saw in chapter 7. This last one, that is Rome, has 7 heads and 10 horns. So that's an image to show us that the beast that this is talking about in Revelation 17 has 7 heads and 10 horns. So 7 heads have to be 7 kings. These are the 5 kingdoms or kings that have fallen already in history. Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, the Greece, the pagan Rome, and papal Rome. And the verse said, one is right now. And we saw from what we studied in chapter 41 and 42 and 43 of Daniel 11, in 1798, France comes to the world power. And from that time till now, we are still in that era of history under the principles of the Kingdom of France. Do you realize that? Why do you think we have the Statue of Liberty in US from France? So we are at the moment in that time is number 6. The one who is, 5 have fallen, one is. And when the next one comes, the verse says in verse 10, he'll come and he'll be for a short space. And that should be and has to be the king of the north, which is Turkey. When they have a caliphate, a Khalifa or a caliph elected, they'll all march and come to Jerusalem, making their official headquarters, and they will rule the world for a short while. We need to brace ourselves for that time. It's going to be a time of huge bloodshed worldwide. If you read Revelation 19 or Revelation 9, you can even have the picture of a lot of human bombs all around the world. So France is number 6. We are in that time. The 7th we said is the king of the north, Turkey. Who is the 8th? As the last verse said in 11. Who is the 8th? And he said he's even of the 7. We'll address that next week with complete detail. Then in Revelation 18, 1 to 3, it speaks about this same power of the beast. It says, and after these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the whole of every foul spirit. What has become a habitation of devils? Babylon. And we'll identify that next week. And the whole of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean, hateful bird. For all nations, not few, all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And the kings of the earth, every nation, kindred, and tongue, worldwide, kings of all the earth of every nation, have committed fornication with her, with Babylon. And merchants of the earth, businessmen, are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. And it's all been happening now for quite a while, and it's getting worse and deeper into what we just read. Verse 8 says, therefore shall her plagues come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she shall be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judgeth her. Now, in short, what I want to tell you is, when the Khalifa or Caliph of Islam is elected and they march forward to Jerusalem and making their headquarters, they will rule the world for almost a year. Because one day, here in the Bible, this plagues is brought for whom? For the devil and his angels, the fallen angels, and for this Babylon. She shall be utterly burned with fire. There'll be mourning, there'll be famine. So all that happens during the wrath of God, the 7 last plagues we discussed last week. So the 7 last plagues happens for almost a year. But God has to cut short the time. Because if he doesn't, nobody will survive. And that's what Jesus said in Matthew 24. For the sake of the elect, he will cut short the time. So at that time, Islam will be pretty much through that Khalifa or Caliph who's elected, they'll be ruling the world. And there'll be chaos and havoc worldwide, big time. But we saw last week, or the week before last, and I told you, the last great crisis was the subject, that at that time, something happened, and we'll see that now. Here are some verses in the Bible which clearly tells us that in prophecy, one day equivalent to 1 year. And that's how all the prophecies of the ones that we saw in Daniel 2, 7, and 11 the time frame that Babylon ruled from this year to that year was all calculated by these historians a long time ago in the principle or with the principle of a day for a year. And these are the two verses, Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6. I have appointed thee each day for a year. So when Bible says in Revelation 18 that we read, plagues will come in one day, that means this is for one full year, almost not full year, but for about a year, the plagues will fall because Christ is going to cut it short. Now, Revelation 16:12 and 16, which we read week before last, and the sixth angel poured out the vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. So we read that week before last. The waters are dried up because all have left that area and they have come to make Jerusalem their capital. But during this time, the sixth plague, the way is open. So people from Russia, from India, from China, and all the people from there, not Muslims, everyone outside other than Muslims will come because the Muslims have already come to make Jerusalem the capital and they've taken over all the countries with their power because, as I said, Islam is going to rule under a Khalifa for almost a year during the time of trouble. But what happened the sixth plague? All the nations gathered together for the battle of Armageddon, as we see in the verse below, and they all together have a war with Islam. At the Battle of Armageddon, the armies of the world, including the ones who have come from the east, like Russia, China, and India, under the umbrella of the United Nations, which always was the visible puppet of the beast of Revelation. They will war with the descendants of Ishmael and destroy them completely by the roots. Complete annihilations. Islam, by the roots, wherever they are in the world, at that time, they'll be destroyed by the roots. It's a very sad, solemn thing, but it's a fact that God has forewarned us of that will take place. You know what God said in the very first book of the Bible about Ishmael and his descendants? In Genesis 16:12. And he, that means Ishmael, will be a wild man. He's talking about his descendants, not just him alone. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. When this verse was given, Islam wasn't even born for a couple of thousand years after that. But how did that place become a Muslim world? How was Islam brought into existence? We're going to cover that next time with more detail. Couple of points, especially for the academic and self-appointed PhDs in theology, that I want to bring forth now. There are 7 churches discussed in the book of Revelation, in which, besides mentioning each of their characteristics, shows also the timeline of God's church in the years after Christ, all the way to his second advent. There are also 7 seals in Revelation, which discuss with the history of God's professed people alongside the 7 churches. So 7 seals are about the history of God's church. Then we have a comprehensive mention and enumeration of the 7 trumpets, which reveals the history on the acts of the various nations of planet Earth, world events, political events. The last 3 trumpets are called woes. First woe, second woe, and third woe, as recorded in chapter 9 and 11 of Revelation. History clearly testifies that Islam, or the Mohammedans, had a primary role in both the first woe and the second woe. As the Bible is the only consistent book in the entire planet, why would inconsistent interpretations by the many so-called experts of prophecy attribute the third woe to be any other entity than Islam? For the prophetic stream of light to be consistent with the names used in Scripture, and for the prophecies of the book of Daniel to be in complete sync with the book of Revelation, the third woe too, like the first and the second woe, has to have Islam, which is the king of the north, in an emphatic role. Lastly, after the Islam Caliph is elected, and they march to Jerusalem to make it their official headquarters, which of course means complete annihilation of Israel by the roots, except of those who have repented and given themselves completely to Christ. Probation of all humanity for reconciliation and or the privilege to be amongst the redeemed will close forever very soon after this event of Daniel 11:45. As the next verse, which is Daniel 12:1 says, that Michael stands up, meaning there is no more interceding on man's behalf, and the destiny of every human being is forever finalized. It is a very solemn truth, my friends, and a solemn thought. I hope that none of us will dilly-dally and sit on the fence for too long, is my prayer for all of us.